inclusive and green development. And sustainable value chains is also one way that we can look at it. In fact, there is a research that Center for Responsible Business recently concluded, and there are some important messages that I would like to share. Now, when we're looking at global value chains, sustainability definitely flows through them. Like, how do we look at sustainable value chains? And research shows that, when you're integrated into global value chains, there's definitely a growth in your sustainable impact. However, it is not what you are completely expecting. We don't always achieve what we set out to do. And there are a few reasons for that. If I were to quickly summarize them, right, that sustainability has been looked down very top-down. I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. There is wonderful work, and we've been hearing that since morning, that happens at the grassroots level, at the local level. So how is it that sustainable value chains or global value chains take cognizance of that work? We've also heard about the local wisdom, the traditional wisdom, which is important to build upon, to draw upon as we look at sustainable solutions. And most importantly, where is it that we want the impact? What about the vulnerable, the marginalized, the local communities who are often left out of this dialogue? And we saw today that when we develop our solutions keeping these communities in mind, the sustainability and inclusion impact that we achieve is at a totally different scale. One other important message, and I think Honorable Chief Minister Mr. Sangma raised this, is that sustainable action is a continuous improvement process. We really cannot look at it as black and white. It's not that I achieve it overnight, right? How do I build the capacities? How do we make available the resources for everyone to get onto the sustainability pathway? I think that is something very important. We also had the opportunity at CRB to submit with partner ADB a policy brief under T20 on sustainable and inclusive value chains. And certain things that we suggested is that how can we look at a set of common sustainability and climate indicators that speak to the most vulnerable, the marginalized groups, and how can they be integrated in the global value chains? How do we look at a financing roadmap for sustainability and inclusion, especially with a focus on small enterprises, women, smallholder farmers? And how do we look at collaboration and dialogue and capacity building as we are looking at sustainability in this discourse? Now, I was very heartened to hear in the morning certain things that were talked about, that how do we look at development from grassroots, how do we look at the solutions that local communities are doing, how do we bring women, how do we center stage women, and how do we unlock the finance? Then again was the issue that how do we look at a collaborative approach, how do we get dialogues going in? And I'm very happy to share that I have a panel here today who in their own experience and insights are covering all the topics that we talked about in the morning. I have Mr. Gurung who will talk about his experience in ecotourism and the impact and how do you get the local communities involved. I have Mr. Datta talking about dialogues and collaboration and looking at a local perspective. Ms. Neha Kumar, who says that how climate finance can really, accelerate action on sustainability and what needs to be done. Ms. Sukanya, who will talk about their work with women on the ground, with informal workers, and how do you empower them. And Mr. Tim Bosch, who will bring the perspective of the global north, and how is it that sustainability is being looked at. So without further ado, because we do have a very tight we do have a very tight schedule. I am going to go with a couple of rounds of questions. My request is that we keep it very brief. Please look at the key messages that you would like to start. And Tim, I'd like to start with you. That, what is the global discourse on sustainable value chains and what are some of the developments that are coming across our way? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, first of all, for curating this session, to you and your organization, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be among you and discuss with you. So I think it's very interesting that we are discussing this topic at the conference that looks at nature solutions more broadly, and I think sustainable value chains are indeed something that's heavily discussed in the global north as well. So, and I think there's several dynamics and several governance instruments that are being developed, including by national legislatures, by supranational organizations like the European Union, and by intergovernmental bodies, which is more soft law. And they build on pre-existing work by the UN on the guiding principles on businesses and human rights, and also on the guidelines for multinational enterprises. But they expand now what we are seeing on these prior works in two ways, which is first, they go beyond strictly the human rights focus that we had in the UN guiding principles to also include environment and, to a lesser extent, maybe we get to that a bit, climate. Then secondly, they are a shift away from voluntary soft law mechanisms that were of a recommendatory nature towards now what is called, mandatory due diligence. So it's mandated by law. And I think this latter aspect of the mandatory requirements is what I would maybe focus on a bit, because it's been, I think, most controversially discussed also. And here there are several. They originate mainly from the national level, and I can maybe just give two examples. One is the French Duty of Vigilance Act of 2017 that requires large corporations to develop and publish a due diligence plan and to kind of persistently revisit and monitor this plan. And it ought to include measures related to both human rights and environmental risks. And then secondly, just by matter of comparison, we have the German Due Diligence Act, which was passed in 2021 and actually just entered into force in January 2023, that applies to large companies with 3,000 employees at an initial stage, and then 1,000 employees as of 2024, so it will get more stringent. And the EU is now also negotiating a diligence law that would then, it's a directive that would then cover the entire EU 27. So maybe I can just say that these laws vary significantly in terms of their scope, their process, and also their enforcement. And I think the scope is maybe something I can say a few more words on, that we see this was also fiercely debated in the legislative process. So the coverage of companies, for instance, in Germany, I already said 3,000 employees at an initial stage. In France, for example, it's less stringent, with only big companies covered, 5,000 plus employees in France, or 10,000 employees worldwide if they have a subsidiary in France. Another dimension in the scope is this reach in the supply chain. So here, for instance, the French law is wider or more stringent in that it covers the entire supply chain, whereas the German law says that the due diligence monitoring only applies to company activities and the direct supplier. And with the second tier supplier, so the supplier of the supplier, it would only apply if there is a substantial risk or knowledge of certain risks that exist already. And so this is, I think, a bit uncertain, and we'll have to see how it develops. And then finally, the coverage of environmental and human rights issues is also varying. So it pertains to social and environmental due diligence, but for instance, the German law does not include biodiversity and climate per se. So we have a certain list of environmental goods that are protected. There's a reference to the Persistent Organic Pollutants Convention, the Minamata Convention on Mercury, and the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste. And then other environmental concerns are included as far as they concern human rights. So and whereas I think the French law is more open to this. So this is the difference in the scope that I just wanted to briefly mention, but overall I think it's an important development that may lead to because it may lead to the fact that there's a compliance risk for companies, and that's a real kind of incentive to act.
Thank you so much, Tim, for laying that out. And I think a key message and a clear message writing on the wall is that it is coming down, and it will come down to global supply chains. But I think the question there is then how do you get the voices of the global south as well, right? And I think, Mr. Datta, here with your work, you can perhaps elaborate on how you've used collaboration and dialogues to really bring center stage some of the voices from the ground.
Thank you, Devyani. Also, very thank you to CRB for curating this, and to ORF and the government of Meghalaya. Before I just go to what you just said, if we're talking about global value chains and sustainable global value chains, well, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. And if we have to make it sustainable, it has to be inclusive. So it's not a question of whether or to do or not. We have to involve communities if we have to make change sustainable. It's true across the world, because also another component of a sustainable value chain is trust. And that's something that every component of the chain needs to speak to each other. There has to be a component of trust. So if I take a systemic view, it links one to the other, but it also, we have to look at the linkages. And in that context, I think global discourses, such as like this, have to be rooted to the ground, of course, but also local discourses have to take cognizance of what is happening at a global level. What are the changes? And also, local discourses also have to recognize the value of the local. Sometimes, we don't value what we have right in our corner. It needs somebody from outside to come and, tell us that this is good for you. So there is a need for dialogue and discussion and trust building across the silos of various disciplines, various communities, various stratas of society. And lastly, for sustainability, we also need to listen to nature and to people who have been listening to nature. I think we have not listened enough to people who listen to nature, in the name of development. At Asian Confluence, you'll be happy to know that we have been curating a series of programs, but I'll mention one of them. It's using using water and our rivers. And when I say rivers, it's not just our overground rivers, but also our underground rivers, water. Water as an entry point to talk about rivers, as we call it, nadi, to talk about connectivity, to talk about commerce, to talk about conservation, to talk about culture and values, to talk about capacity building, and to see how all of these can talk to each other and collaborations can be forged. So this kind of breaking across the silos, I think it's quite important. Speaking of connectivity, I'll just push this point. There's a lot of investment. As we are sitting here in Shillong, we are just about 150 kilometers away from Bangladesh. There is an agreement signed last month where the northeastern part of India can actually export goods now through the Chittagong and Mongla ports. Now, the question comes, if I want to build a value chain like my orange, there was a time, by the way, when Meghalaya used to export oranges. The best Mandarin oranges came from Meghalaya and was exported all over via ropeway from Cherrapunji across to Chittagong and onward by ship. This was a connected region. Now, there's a lot of push as per the government policies. There's a lot of Japanese investment. EU has been talking about investing, other international partners. Now, this connectivity discourse has to be married with a discourse on how do we save our water bodies, How do we conserve our local cultures? How do the aspirations of the local communities be preserved while this development is happening? Is it going to walk over us, or are we going to become a part of it? So these kind of dialogues we feel are very, 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 very important. And that's something that I think we at Asian Confluence have been trying to do. A series of dialogues, not only Nadi, but besides that, others. I'll stop here just to re-emphasize that it has borne fruit. So there is hope at the end of the day.
Thank you so much. I think you brought out a couple of very important points, that global takes cognizance of local, but the local takes cognizance of global as well, and find that balance. And also you look at the multifaceted impact that it will have, that it's not a black and white, or it's not an easy decision, but there are many aspects that you're doing through dialogues. I would now like to come to you, Sukanya, right? And given Seva's work with informal workers and working with a very important community, can you share some examples, on how you're achieving impact and the models that have worked for you? So over to you.
Okay. So thank you, Divyani. First of all, I think I've been saying that for curating this representative panel, because I think for us at Seva, being a grassroots organization, representation is key so that the voices from the ground can reach where the decisions are made. I think starting with this session itself, I think I'll have to say here that sustainability as a definition definitely varies from the lens that you approach it. Because when we talk about global value chains, sometimes we make an easy connotation of corporate value chains and the supply chains that Global South ends up being a part of. But for a grassroots organization, sustainability is about survival. It's not about shared values. So for us, when we work with the poorest of poor, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, for us, sustainability becomes a way of life because we don't have that luxury to make choices. So I think that for us here is the objective of making profit as purpose, not purpose beyond profit. So that is just to set the context. And I think it was really nice today morning to hear our Honorable Chief Minister, who set the tone by saying that livelihoods and environment are not two divergent concepts. They have to go together. And I think that's the whole premise of the work that we do with Seva. I think to just emphasize the approach that we take in our interventions, I can do best by giving an example of one of our green micro-entrepreneurs on the ground, because it's their voice that I'm here to communicate. And I think the approach that we take is that of a need-driven, a demand-driven, participatory, bottoms-up approach. Now, let's just start with a story, because the story that I'm going to tell you of is this particular woman, Saroj Ben, who is from Anand district in Gujarat. So she's a young entrepreneur. Her mother cooks her food on a wood-fired stove. She has been observing respiratory diseases in her households, in the environment around her, but she didn't know the cause. Somebody informed her that maybe the reason for that might be the wood-fired stoves that you use. And there's this government scheme, the Ujjwal scheme, whereby if you just switch to LPG and you might be able to see the difference. So she did that. And I think that's where we come up with the concept of policy being a lever for accessibility. Because when that scheme came, she immediately skipped to LPG as soon as she was made aware of it. Now, she's a grassroots leader. She is very cognizant of what's happening around her and how it could affect her communities around her. So she definitely saw that there was a change in terms of the health benefits that she was getting, the reduction in cost because of the fuel change, and also in the environment around her. So she took it on her to extend the benefits of the scheme to 1,500 women members of Seva to make them switch to LPG. And 45 small and marginal farmers, the farmers who used to work with diesel pumps, she made them shift to solar pumps. Now she wanted to scale up the reach of these initiatives. What she realized was that as soon as you start going to remote interiors, LPG is not that accessible. You cannot take these solutions there. Now the scheme did not address that problem because there is a contextual reality and not every policy schemes can address that. So they came to Seva, to say the people who have been working for 50 years now, and the leadership, and they observed that, we want to change the situation, but we don't know what to do. So Seva, which has always been bottoms up, it has always been about using the existing assets of the women themselves. They're like, but they have cattle, they have cow dungs. Can we use that to produce fuel? So what we did at Seva was we piloted a project with bioingesters. So 20 bioingesters were installed in this village. It was, you just needed 2 cattle per day to produce clean energy for 8 members of the household. Immensely successful, the pilot. You could have cleaner energy, you could save LPG costs, you could extend it to ultimately 500 bioingesters in 9 districts of Gujarat, and then you had partnerships with funders, with social enterprises who could adapt those solutions also customized to the populations you were working for. But that needed the need identification, the demand identification, the understanding of the contextual realities. So that's the approach which the grassroots interventions embody.
Well, thanks for that, Sukanya, because I think an important message that you empower the community and that impacts, and 2, you be cognizant of what the challenges the local community is. If we have a top-down sustainability approach and don't take into account these challenges, we probably will not come up with the right solution. So thank you for that. And Mr. Gurung, I would like to come with you now because you have extensive experience in the ecotourism space. But what is your experience and the impact that you're seeing on the ground?
Thank you. Thanks to the government of Meghalaya, ORF, Devyani, especially, and CRB for inviting me to this panel discussion, to this event. Very interesting discussions. I've been listening to very interesting discussion in the morning. And what I'm going to speak on, I think somehow finds resonance to what everyone is saying we need to do. So it's a very sort of a very micro level intervention that my organization ECOS did. And it covers ecotourism, rural tourism, and in particular homestays, So we all have heard what tremendous potential we have in the Northeast, in places like Sikkim and in the mountain states of the Indian Himalayan region in terms of ecotourism assets, the scenery, the biodiversity, and rich cultural heritage. So what we did was that way back, how it started was that in 2002, way back in 2002, we, along with the help from the International Ecotourism Society, TIES, and the Ministry of Tourism, we organized the South Asian Regional Conference on Ecotourism in Gangtok, Sikkim. That was probably one of the first international meetings we had there. And this proved to be a milestone for the introduction of ecotourism in the Northeast. We had just heard about ecotourism. The concept was not very clear to us. It was happening in Costa Rica and other places. So one of the biggest concerns we had in Sikkim was the growing mass tourism. We saw our neighbors there in Darjeeling where it was really going big. So we said that's not the direction which tourism should take. So one of the great takeaways from the conference was the Sirubari homestay model. The Sirubari is a tiny village in next to Pokhara in western Nepal where practically every family had someone in the army, and through most of the year, that room used to remain vacant. So they actually converted it into a homestay, a single homestay, and that's how it developed. If you look up Sirubari, it's still there, functioning, doing great over there. So subsequently, we experimented in Sikkim in the 4 districts, and we started homestays there, and it was very successful. So I think by now, I think homestays has become quite a common word in the tourism sector. So you may be knowing that it actually it provides to it's living, going and living in a village with a villager and experiencing the local culture, agricultural practices, the ethnic cuisine and natural attractions, and a very close and personalized service because you're living with a family, and which is not available in a hotel. There's no this sort of a close contact. So today we have over, I think, about 500 to 1,000 homestays in Sikkim, and they're doing very well. Even in tribal areas like Zongu, there are homestays there. In fact, the Crown Prince of Norway and his family actually visited a homestay there. So now, if you look at it, I mean, just the nutshell of this thing, if you look at it, analyze it, especially community-managed homestays, if it is planned and supported and marketed well, it offers a unique model for rural development. Prior to the introduction, very little tourism benefits was actually trickling down to the rural level. The big tour operators would come and bring their groups. They would stay in the big cities, and they would take the tourists to the rural areas. They would enjoy the scenery, probably carry their own lunch also, and go back. So there was nothing going to the rural people. So now homestays have allowed tourism services such as accommodation, food, guiding services, transport, handicrafts and value-added products to be provided from within the village to the tourists. Okay, this has a sort of a multiplier effect on the village economy with relatively very low investment. And in many ways, it has also stemmed rural-urban migration, And homestays also provide opportunities to the marginalized and vulnerable sector. So it's the woman in the household who actually does the cooking for the tourist, who makes up the room, does all the washing and all that. And then, so she gets to partake in the income of the family. Otherwise, it was generally male-dominated, and they wouldn't share much of the income, leading to things like alcoholism and things like that, So, and then it's tribal culture that is, the main attraction here. You're addressing that sector. And the youth. Youth become, nature guides, birding guides, things like that. So this is also keeping in trend with the growing demand for experiential forms of tourism. Now, people, they say they don't want to go and stay in a hotel. You want to experience something different, So I think, and then there's also a great deal of learning here, cross-cultural interactions. The tourist there shares his knowledge and experience and their culture, and the homestay owner also shares what they have, the knowledge that they have. So this is a great model. I think it really needs to be looked at.
Thank you so much. I think you've brought out a beautiful example of development or bringing a solution right at the grassroots, and some of the benefits that, we hadn't thought of, like the cultural exchange and knowledge. So thank you so much for that. And Neha, now I'll come to you and, your experience, because we heard about the need for finance, that, we're looking at the global north as well. We are looking at how we unlock finance. What, according to you, is the potential of finance, and what are some of those new ways of financing that we are looking at when it comes to climate and sustainability?
Thank you, Devyani, and thank you, ORF and G20, T20 for making this the topic of discussion, because I think this is very central to how we move forward. And when it comes to finance, everybody talks about trillions of dollars of opportunity and trillions of dollars of gap. And I breathe and live that world. So, trillion-dollar question, what can finance do, and is it enabling sustainability? From a bottom-up perspective, which means that are we looking at supply chains, etc. And from whatever I have heard this morning, we are looking at all of those things, whether that is nature, whether that's mitigation, adaptation, from a financing perspective. So if I could reframe your question, Devyani, that is capital interested in being part of the solution? Then I would say resoundingly yes. Why? Because anything related to sustainability, nature, risk, even the risk of exclusion is clearly an investment risk for financiers, whether they are lenders or they're investors coming from different segment of capital. But with all of that, we also heard that you top it up now with supply chains, with bottom-up, with nature-based solutions, which very quickly get into the resilience aspect and adaptation aspect. Then you clearly see that actually not much finance is flowing. Not much finance is flowing from global north to global south. Not much finance is flowing to this theme per se. Okay? If I could just give you a couple of statistics, and I was just noting that down today. out of all the GEF, GCF, Adaptation Fund, GEF Trust Fund in India, Global Facility for Disaster Risk Recovery, they are nearly about 15 projects in all, under $400 million in all, okay? And you talked about MDBs and DFIs channeling money to adaptation and resilience or nature-based solutions. There are I can count the number of projects, under 6, and even within that, clean tech is getting more money and adaptation and resilience is not getting that kind of money. So we truly have a huge problem over here, and I will, at least in this round, point out to 4 main challenges and barriers why the finance is not able to flow despite knowing that the dividends on economy, equity, resilience are multifold. One is, Devyani, it is simply a lack of awareness of knowledge. There is simply not that kind of knowledge within the financial community as well as within those people who want to raise that money about the benefits that or the sources of finance, okay? And the second is a very clear lack of tools. And one prominent tool is actually a classification system, why it is otherwise known as taxonomy, that what do these climate resilience look like? How do we even identify those investments? And how do we measure those impacts? So there is simply no tool right now. Third risk, I think, is the risk of, the barrier is the barrier of scale. You cannot right now, the trouble is that we all look for big scale, but as Samir mentioned in the morning, is that really the solution? Yes, big scale reduces transaction costs and is able to get capital in, but perhaps you need to be able to look at scaling out of replicable small-scale models, and that, in a way, is a big barrier and is a very big risk, Devyani, that big capital might crowd out small capital, big projects might crowd out small projects, and where in these nature-based and resilient solutions, where things are not monetizable in the short term, there is also a time horizon mismatch for financiers and investors, and not to be able to see the scale, monetizability, all of those are actually the big barriers to making the finance flow. But if we have time, I will give you the solutions for it also, because there are.
Thank you so much, Neha. I think you've very nicely put together the gap between the intent and the action, right? And I think the issue that we are hearing, that a lot of solutions that we heard are small-scale solutions, and does that mean that they don't get financing? So I think the issue of scale-out is equally important as scale-up. So thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to each one of you, because you've nicely summed up on what's happening or what are the challenges. But if you can, in a few moments, and we are a little short on time, but please do share from your perspective those top 3, 4 action points, because what we heard in the morning is that how can we move forward? What is actionable? That if we are talking about this issue of sustainability and making it a widespread conversation and embedding it in global value chains, then from your perspective, what are those 3, 4 things, whether it be collaboration, whether it be getting different stakeholders, whether it be knowledge sharing, that we need to do to really accelerate this conversation? So I'm going to start on the same order, and Tim, requesting you to go first.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think this was very insightful, and I think just coming back to what I said before, I think, if the Global North decides to put in place a mandatory regulatory framework with the declared ambition to protect human rights and environment in the Global South, then the Global South needs to be involved in the discussion about how those rules will be evolving, right? So, and I think this is a debate that's not finished. The EU legislation is in process and is being developed. One of the controversial issues that I think we've seen with the national laws, and that will likely persist also now, is the question of what about the remedies in case there's an infringement of the due diligence requirements, right? So how, if, you know, down the value chain, there has been a breach of due diligence, or environmental or human rights have been harmed because of a failure to exercise due diligence, will there be a mechanism to consult? And I mean, there's fines oftentimes, but the question is also how can we include affected populations? And one controversial question is, for instance, if there should be a civil liability claim. So if populations that are affected by human rights or environmental violations, whether they should have a right to sue corporations under tort law, you know, for having their damage replaced, for example. The German law eventually decided against it, while the French law has it. So I think it's I mean, this is an open debate. So this pertains to within the due diligence framework, and very briefly, I think outside that, I think it's important to say that no matter how the policies are designed, these kind of mandatory due diligence guidelines, they will not be likely to be all-encompassing and covering all parts of the value chain, because that's, you know, that's very difficult. For instance, for small and medium-sized companies, sometimes it's very hard for them to understand where even the value chains begin, and so it's very unlikely, I think, no matter how the policy design will be, that this will be the golden bullet. It needs to be flanked, therefore, by climate foreign policy, by engagement, by dialogue, which is obviously a role for foreign policy, but also for companies, I think, to reframe what their role is also in these kinds of conversations. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. That's, I think, very, very pointed and good advice. Sukanya? Sorry, I will go to Mr. Datta. I'm sorry.
No, I'll make it very short and simple for you. I would like to draw from what Neha said about, lack of appetite or lack of finance moving to the ground. I think that there is a need for much more awareness building on what is the value at the bottom for at the root, I would say, the value at the root. There has to be much more building of capacity of the root to absorb finance, much more capacity for them to articulate, the communities to articulate their strengths and their needs, and some kind of translators moving up the chain so that this voice is heard up when you sit and listen to talk about make policies on human rights or or any kind of balancing or legislation. Are we really hearing the voice and their aspirations and their references and their nuances and their cultures and all of their history, their culture, all of it. And I think Meghalaya as a state, I think has done really well in terms of engaging with the roots. We heard a slew of programs that have happened today. And much more needs to happen, much more, I think. And as the Chief Minister said today, we need to look at this region, the entire region. And if we're looking at the region, we've just not even, scratched the surface, really. So there's a need for engaging top-down, sideways, bottom-up, top-down. More and more of interactions is needed. And I think my last point is, it's a huge task. But a way forward is to take a thread. If we want to make a value chain out of buckwheat, for somebody who said in the panel earlier, or an orange from here, how do we move it from end to end? Take a systemic view from the start, producer, to the end of the, and look at it at all the cogs in the links of the value chain and see where the links. I think this kind of a need is very much there, at least in this part of the world, where many things are happening, but not talking to each other.
Thank you so much for that, Sukanya.
So just picking up from where Sabyacha left off at, awareness. Like I think awareness from a grassroots perspective of the green tech solutions, of the solutions models which would actually be helpful in their respective trades, because like I said, livelihoods is intrinsically linked. So awareness has to be built there. Second, simplification of policies, because the terms, the technical interpretations, connotations, they do not make more sense in terms of their contextual realities. So how do you have periodic dialogues and engagements in terms of addressing their needs? And third, I think at Seva, one thing that we keep on advocating for is a three-way partnership. So moving from public-private partnerships to public-private social enterprise partnerships, so that we can address accessibility, affordability, and obviously adaptability, because women-led design is crucial to women-led development if we are putting them at the center. I think especially with Seva, what has worked with us in terms of financing is being open to innovative financing mechanisms, so blended finance. Also alternative economic opportunities, because organizing women in cooperatives, federations enables the outflow of cash flow within the federation. So small debts can be taken, small scale projects can at least be scaled up to prove successful pilots, after which partnerships become incredibly easy. And lastly, I would just like to leave with the idea of decentralized models. I know it's quite ironic because we're talking about global value chains, but I think just the idea of 100-mile communities, the principle that the founder of Seva, Shri Ila Bhatt, suggested, that if within 100 miles radius, we are able to address all the essential needs, food, clothes, shelter, health, education, finance, this ensures that you end up building resilient local value chains, which would be the stepping stone for building coherent, integrated global value chains. And I think one need is not independent of another. I think that is something that we need to keep in our mind, because we are talking about integrated, cohesive development for the holistic development of the society. So yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sukanya, for succinctly putting that together. Mr. Gurung?
Yeah, I think in a broader context, if you look at it, I'm still with the tourism sector, is actually you need to increase the regional and local value addition. So you need to ensure that the maximum tourism revenues stay within the community and the region. So you need to design your products that way, and you know how you get the local community involved. The Northeast has so many niche, such great agrobiodiversity and such niche products. Like if you take example, the cucumbers you get in Nagaland, nowhere else you get that, but there is no volume for that, and you can't sell it on a volume basis, scale it up and do that. It's, I think, probably through this tourism medium, you could probably, get a market. I'll give you an example. During the COVID period, now tourism was one of the first sectors that was impacted and the last to recover. But interestingly, for the homestays, they innovated. They were already doing agriculture, because we always say that your homestays are an additional source of income there. So they started online marketing of agro-produce, and they were not impacted that way. The other tourism service providers, they totally shut down. So that is one, and marketing is another one. But the marketing and what is happening today in tourism sector is like, it's just everything is online. So people, when they travel or go on a holiday, they just start looking at prices, and then that pushes down the prices for the local homestay owners. So that's not fair. So it has to be adequate and fair marketing and appropriate. The tourists must be informed, given the true information about the community, what they can expect, and things like that. So there are a lot of things, but I'll probably stick to that.
Okay, thank you so much. And Neha, you talked about solutions, so very briefly, if you can.
3 solutions. So the first is just look at finance on a spectrum. Again, do not look at it in silos, because where you are in your maturity, you will attract and you will need different kinds of finance. Whether that is grant capital, whether that is risk-taking capital, venture capital in most of these projects. And then as the projects mature, then it is bank loans or capital markets and bond markets. All of that is possible, but you should be able to identify those projects and match make to those financial sources. Second, I would really say that here we are sitting in the Northeast. For India, it can be an exemplar in how to mobilize finance for nature-based solutions and on adaptation and resilience through state action. And I will really urge, because from what I heard, I think we are sitting almost ready to launch ourselves. You just don't know, we don't know how. And the solution, one of the solutions is, look at what the central government has done. It issued a sovereign green bond. It produced a framework which has inclusion categories and exclusion categories. And it raised money from the market domestically. It also invited international investors who participated, and it was a huge success. Maharashtra, very close on the heels, has announced that it will issue green bonds on budget. So given where you are on your fiscal responsibility and limits, you could raise finance either directly as a government on budget, through, say, state development loans, right, SDLs, or you could look at any of your institutions who could go to the market and raise that finance. And that is possible because I think nature, agriculture, forest cover, all of that, it is in bounty and is a source of not only ecosystem services, and so there are revenue models which are, I think, pretty much existing. You need a demonstration, and you can begin with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and a big thank you to all of you for actually remaining well within time and cutting down on your thoughts. I'm just going to refrain from summarizing, but I do have one more speaker that I would like to invite, and we were quite fortunate to have Mr. Nicholas Bouchou, who will join us from the ADB Institute. He's the special advisor to the T7 and the co-chair of the T20 Task Force 3 for India. And he has a very varied experience, but in particular today, he's going to share his reflections on what he heard on the panel, plus also how, we are looking at integrating voices of the global south and global value chains, and lastly, how the G20 is looking at this issue. So, sir, you have about 5 minutes, and then I have to close. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Devyani, for giving me the opportunity to share a few words. When I was listening to the discussion, all the ingredients of the typical difficulty to address both ends of the chain, that is the global value chains on the one hand, and the local or localized experiments on the other hand, or to address global finance on the one hand and community-led initiatives all together, right, is something that is extremely difficult. This morning, the word scaling up was put on the table. But experience shows that you don't scale up when it comes to addressing profound systemic transformations. However, if it's just about addressing those systemic transformations without any regard to the value of interconnected or not local initiatives, community-led initiatives, women-led initiatives, then we are also missing something. And I think a very important argument also is linked to the fact that including, or especially about biodiversity or nature-based solutions, which is still a topic which is very much to be explored. If big finance, I think was Nela mentioning that, comes in, and the result is that all other existing sets of initiatives are put on the side because nobody knows exactly how they would be corresponding to issuing a green bond at state or municipal level, that's a catastrophe, right? The social consequences are negative. But then how it seems impossible, right? It's a nightmarish Rubik's Cube. When you address biodiversity and nature-based solutions at scale, then it seems you are losing track of what can be achieved locally. And reversely, if it is only a collection of local or small initiatives that should be scaled up, then time's going on, and the negative existing trends affecting biodiversity or climate at planetary scale will just continue with very limited possibility to counteract. So what about the solutions, right? We are here also to talk about solutions. Obviously, putting the issues of rights, human rights was mentioned, and so on, is absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. So I believe, and I will finish with this, the value of having a conversation like this one in the context of the very last mile of the preparation of the G20 summit is extremely important. If you look now, and this was said but elusively this morning, climate finance is already a difficult topic, but biodiversity finance is a tiny spot in this galaxy, right? And we are far, far from addressing the issues at scale. There was a report issued last week by Oxford Economics, clearly showcasing that we are not yet there, absolutely not, but also showcasing that arenas or forums like the G20 in the context of fragmented geopolitics are absolutely critically necessary to put forward a number of figures, but also to make sure that the issues of the local are not forgotten on the way. That's the first point. Linked with this, the notion of public goods or global public goods, right, as an articulation of these different dimensions, do offer a very promising short-term way to not scale up, but to address at scale the issues. Second point, the issue of life and life economy. It's extremely good news that the G20 Development Working Group issued just 2 weeks ago sets of life principles for sustainable development. A number of the issues that were discussed in this particular conversation are being addressed, but this is brand new, and it will require all the skill and talents of the G20 presidency of India to further convince all the partners. This has been done so yet because there was a wide consensus, and it is not easy to find a consensus in this moment. And I would like to leave this with this note of hope, but also a note of necessity. That is not just about, I think we need to go beyond this local versus global or scaling up, etc. Pathways to necessary transformations require dedicated actions at all scales at the same time. And moments of crystallizations, moments of catalytic moments, such as the G20 summit, can be absolutely critically important, because then it can be delivered to conventions and other regional agreements. And the very last word I would like to mention is infrastructure. Don't forget about infrastructure, be it the role of grey infrastructure, digital infrastructure, social infrastructure, but also infrastructures that are linked with a much better understanding of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. This is also something that starts to be addressed by the public sector, the private sector, and I would say one measure of success of the G20 India in that regard would also be to promote a new vision of integrated infrastructure in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think we will run out of time if we try to summarize, but some great points in there. And each one is a conversation on its own. I would urge you that please do look up the panelists, engage with them after the conversation, because there's so much more that they have to say. So thank you so much. I would look to the organizers to see if we have any time to take questions, because I was told time is up 15 minutes ago. So you have to please let me know if we can take some questions from the audience. I'm sorry, I believe that's a no. So with that, I'm happy to wrap up this panel discussion, and thank you once again for some lovely insights and a definite way forward. So look forward. I think we have a picture. Do you now? We have a picture, yes.